Long before Europe ruled the church, many black popes ruled Rome and changed history forever. But why did the church bury his story? Do they fear that if the truth of history came roaring back, people would rise and demand a black pope? Let's find out. The history of black popes started with Victor I. When Victor I rose to the papacy around 189 AD, the church was still an underground movement, fragile, fragmented, and feared. Rome's elite barely registered the Christians as anything more than a nuisance, a splinter cult of Jewish radicals whispering strange prayers in dark corners of the empire. But Victor didn't come from the marble palaces or the comfortable hills of Rome. He came from the edge of the empire, from the sun-scorched plains of Roman Africa. And from the moment he took power, he made it clear: the church would no longer be a hidden, apologetic sect. It would speak with authority, and it would speak so that every man, woman, and child could understand. Victor's first bold move was linguistic, but it was a revolution disguised as translation. Until his time, the church's liturgy and scriptures were rooted in Greek, the language of scholars, philosophers, and the highborn. Ordinary Romans, the builders, farmers, and soldiers who would eventually fill the pews, couldn't even understand it. Victor smashed that barrier. He pushed for Latin to replace Greek in the Roman Church's public life, making the faith accessible to the common people for the first time. This was more than a convenience. It was a coup. By making Christianity speak the language of the empire's streets and courts, Victor planted the seeds for the church's eventual dominance of Western civilization. He didn't wait for Christianity to be accepted by the empire. He made Christianity speak like the empire, and in doing so, he rewired its destiny. But Victor wasn't content with changing the tongue of faith. He went after its heart. At the time, one of the biggest battles within Christianity was about Easter. Different communities celebrated it on different days, some clinging to Jewish Passover traditions, others marking it on Sundays to honor the resurrection. It might seem like a small squabble today, but back then, it threatened to split the fragile church apart. Victor acted with a sharpness that shocked many. He demanded uniformity, that Easter should be celebrated on Sunday by all Christians, everywhere. And when the bishops of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey, refused, Victor did the unthinkable. He excommunicated them. Yes, an African pope excommunicated entire regions of bishops to enforce unity. Some thought him too harsh. Even other church leaders protested his severity. But Victor's point was clear. A universal church needed one voice, one calendar, one heart. Without Victor's iron will, Christianity might have fractured permanently into dozens of isolated sects, arguing over sacred dates. Instead, it marched toward unity, a unity that would eventually allow it to conquer the Roman Empire itself. But even as he fought theological wars, Victor's papacy revealed something far more dangerous to Rome's ruling classes. The church was no longer a foreign curiosity. It was becoming Roman and African at the same time. Think about it. A black man, a foreigner, commanding bishops, dictating practices, and reshaping a religion in the very shadow of Caesar's throne. Victor I was a living contradiction to everything the empire believed about race, power, and divinity, and it terrified them. Perhaps that is why so few today speak his name with the reverence he deserves. Victor wasn't simply a caretaker pope, he was an architect. He laid the foundations for a church that could survive beyond the borders of Jerusalem, beyond the academies of Greece, and even beyond the arrogance of Rome. And yet, like many black figures who built civilizations in the shadows of empire, his legacy was quietly folded into the marble silence of history. But if you listen closely, through the echoing halls of basilicas and the whispered prayers of centuries, you can still hear his revolution. A faith for the people in the language of the people, led by a man who refused to bow. Victor's death around 199 AD closed a chapter, but it opened something bigger. A new kind of church, fierce, unified, and ready to outlive empires. But Victor's fight for unity would be only the beginning. Second, we have Pope Miltiades. If Pope Victor I taught the church how to speak like an empire, then Pope Miltiades taught it how to survive one and emerge stronger. By the early 300s, Christianity was on the edge of extinction. Rome was bleeding from civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. Blame fell easily on Christians, and when emperors needed a scapegoat, They unleashed their fury with terrifying efficiency. The Great Persecution, launched by Emperor Diocletian, tore through the Christian world like a storm. Churches were burned, scriptures were seized and destroyed. Thousands of believers were jailed, tortured, or executed. It was into this furnace that Miltiades, a son of Africa, was called to lead. When he became pope in 311 AD, Miltiades knew he wasn't just inheriting a church, he was inheriting a battlefield. And yet, fate was shifting. That same year, an unexpected figure rose to power in the West, Constantine, a general who would change everything. Constantine, unlike his predecessors, saw an opportunity in the Christians. He admired their organization, their loyalty, and their refusal to break under persecution. He issued the Edict of Toleration, which granted Christians a fragile peace after centuries of bloodshed. It was Miltiades who had to guide the church through this moment of sudden, dizzying change. It would have been easy to falter. The Christians were traumatized, leaderless, and divided between those who had resisted torture and those who had broken under it. Accusations flew. Who was worthy to remain in the church? Could traitors be forgiven? Could persecutors be trusted? Miltiades answered not with words, but with actions. First, he moved the papal seat into a new home, the Lateran Palace, a vast imperial property gifted by Constantine himself. The Pope, once a fugitive, now ruled from a palace that once housed Roman nobility. It was a moment thick with symbolism. The church was no longer beneath the empire. It was entering its very halls, not as a conquered servant, but as a partner. But Miltiades wasn't blinded by luxury. He understood the dangers hidden within the emperor's favor. He called a synod, a great council, to deal with the Donatist schism, a fierce debate about the purity of the clergy. The Donatists, many of whom came from Africa like Miltiades, argued that any clergy who had buckled during persecution could never again lead the faithful. It was a brutal question. Can mercy exist after betrayal? Miltiades ruled with wisdom and compassion. He insisted that human weakness, even under torture, did not invalidate faith. He defended the idea that the sacrament's power came from God, not from the personal virtue of the priest. A priest might fail, but Christ would not. With that, Miltiades prevented a devastating civil war within the church, a war that could have shattered its newfound peace just as it began to taste freedom. But it wasn't just a theological victory, it was a deep understanding of what survival meant. Miltiades knew that the future church had to be wide enough to embrace the broken, not just the strong. A church of only the perfect would die. A church of forgiveness would grow. In a way, Miltiades wasn't just building a church after persecution. He was building a church for all future ages. A church that could outlive emperors, invaders, corruption, and even its own mistakes. And he did it without spectacles, without armies, without gold, just with the quiet, unshakable strength that so often defines the leader's history, forgets. He died in 314 AD, only 3 years after his election. He did not live to see Constantine's full embrace of Christianity or the Council of Nicaea that would follow. But without Miltiades, there might not have been a Christianity left to legalize. He carried the church across a death line, from hunted sect to protected faith. And he did it in the greatest moment of confusion, when others could have collapsed into vengeance, division, or despair. He taught the church not just how to survive persecution, but how to heal after it. He was an African pope, a black leader, a survivor who turned the ashes of martyrdom into the seeds of a new civilization. Then came Pope Gelasius I. When Miltiades guided the church through survival, he handed it over to a new generation, stronger but vulnerable. The emperors, once executioners, now knelt at the altar. But power rarely bows without strings attached. By the time Gelasius I rose to the papacy in 492 AD, the empire no longer sought to destroy the church, it sought to own it. And Gelasius, an African by birth but Roman by training, stood as the immovable wall against this imperial ambition. He ruled in a world where kings imagined themselves as priests, and priests were tempted to act like kings. It was a thin, dangerous line, and most men would have stumbled across it. Gelasius did not. His weapon was not a sword or gold, it was something far sharper, The idea of separation of powers, a concept centuries ahead of its time, In his famous letter to Emperor Anastasius I, a document that would echo down through the Middle Ages into modern democracy, Gelasius declared something revolutionary. There are two powers by which the world is ruled, the sacred authority of priests and the royal power of kings. Of these two, the authority of the priests is the greater, because they are responsible even for the kings of men before God. In one stroke, Gelasius rewrote the rules of civilization. No longer would the emperor be seen as a divine ruler, holding spiritual and political power in one hand. The soul belonged to God alone, through his church, not to any earthly throne. This wasn't just theory. Gelasius lived it with ferocity. When the Byzantine emperor tried to impose imperial control over religious matters, Gelasius refused him, bluntly, publicly, and fearlessly. When disputes broke out over who could control the patriarchates, Gelasius insisted that Rome, not Constantinople, held primacy, setting the course for centuries of papal supremacy. And he didn't stop at theology. Internally, he reorganized church charity systems, ensuring that the wealth flowing into the church didn't just enrich bishops, but fed the poor. He carefully reformed liturgy, codifying prayers and rituals that would shape Catholic worship for a millennium. He strengthened the sacramental life of the church at every level, tightening its identity, defining its soul. Gelasius understood that a church entangled in imperial politics would lose its moral authority, and he fought, sometimes alone, to keep the church not just holy, but free. Yet despite his fierce stand, Gelasius was no arrogant ideologue. He was a deeply spiritual man, obsessed with the weight of the sacraments and the duty of humility before God. To him, the Pope wasn't a king among men. The Pope was a servant, a trembling steward of mysteries too vast for any crown. And so he ruled with a paradoxical blend of unyielding strength and profound humility. Few today realize how much they owe to this African Pope. When modern leaders speak of separation of church and state, they echo Gelasius. When medieval popes defied kings, it was Gelasius's doctrine they cited. When the church resisted being a political toy in dark centuries, it was Gelasius's courage that had lit the path. Without him, the church could easily have become just another department of the empire, a pawn on an emperor's chessboard, rather than the conscience of civilization. But Gelasius held the line. And because he did, the church was able to stand independent, able to criticize, to correct, to guide. A few years after he died in 496 AD, the world he fought to protect would change dramatically again. The Western Roman Empire collapsed into ruin, the Eastern Empire recoiled into itself, and Europe fell into what would later be called the Dark Ages. But the church, the battered, defiant church, survived. Because of Gelasius, because of Africa's son, who stood unshaken before emperors. And yet, after centuries, his name, like those of Victor and Miltiades, faded into the quiet corridors of history, uncelebrated, often unmentioned, buried under layers of European reinvention. But the truth remains. Before cathedrals soared, before kingdoms fell at the foot of the cross, before Europe even knew how to govern itself, it was black popes who taught the church how to survive, how to lead, and how to remain free. And now, as the church again stands at a crossroads, struggling against irrelevance, scandal, and division, the question returns. Is it time to remember the strength we once had? Is it time for Africa to lead again? History doesn't just whisper, sometimes it roars. The story of Victor, Miltiades, and Gelasius isn't a museum piece. It's a manual for survival, one that the Catholic Church desperately needs today. In 2025, the Church faces a crisis deeper than any since the days of persecution. It is not the lions of the Colosseum that threaten it now, but something quieter, deadlier, irrelevance. In Europe, the churches are emptying. In America, faith has fractured into political theater. In many places where cathedrals once thundered with hymns, they now echo hollow under tourist footsteps. Meanwhile, in Africa, the church is not dying, it's exploding with life. Across Nigeria, Uganda, the Congo, and beyond, baptismal fonts overflow. Seminaries are packed. Masses stretch for hours, with choirs so full of energy they seem to shake the earth itself. The numbers are staggering. By 2050, estimates suggest more than 40% of all Catholics will live in Africa. Not Europe, not North America, Africa. Yet the hierarchy remains locked, like an old gate, in the corridors of the global north. Slow to see that the map of Catholicism has already been redrawn. It is here that the lessons of the first African popes cry out again. Because when Victor made the church speak Latin, he wasn't just translating words, he was dragging the faith into the language of its future. When Miltiades crossed the church into legitimacy, he wasn't just surviving, he was adapting to a world in flux. When Gelasius separated the church from the emperor, he wasn't just defying power, he was preserving the soul for centuries to come. Each faced moments when the church could have collapsed under the weight of fear, division, or seduction. Each saved it, not by nostalgia, but by audacity. Today's church does not need another administrator, another careful caretaker polishing the brass of a sinking ship. It needs audacity again. It needs a leader who understands growth not as a line on a report, but as a fire in the bones. A leader who has lived through chaos, division, and hope. A leader who comes from a part of the world where the church is still a living, breathing miracle, not a cultural artifact. It needs Africa. But this is not about charity, or inclusion, or political correctness. It's about survival. It's about recognizing where the river of faith now flows fastest and letting its strongest swimmers lead. It's about remembering that the church's greatest transformations often came from its margins, from men like Victor, Miltiades, and Gelasius, whose skin and soil were different, but whose courage was universal. The irony is almost brutal. A church that preaches universality has, for centuries, been reluctant to reflect it fully in its highest office. But the time for caution has long passed. The global South, and especially Africa, has already become the heart of Catholicism. The only question now is whether Rome will acknowledge it before it's too late. There are men already standing ready, cardinals, bishops, theologians, and servants of the gospel whose roots stretch from the plains of Senegal to the hills of Uganda, from the streets of Kinshasa to the villages of Ghana. They carry with them not just faith, but the hard-won wisdom of surviving poverty, war, injustice, and colonial scars, and turning wounds into strength. Their leadership would not be historic because of their skin. It would be historic because it would finally align the church's leadership with the living reality of its people. A black pope today would not be a radical break. It would be a return to the days when African strength, vision, and spiritual fire carried the church through its darkest nights. It would be the restoration of a lineage unfairly hidden and unfairly forgotten. And perhaps most importantly, it would be a powerful sign to the world, a world fractured by racism, cynicism, and despair, that the church remembers its true face. Not European, not African, not American, but universal. A church led by a man from Africa would declare, without apology, the future belongs to those who still believe. And Africa still believes. History is already moving. The faithful are already moving. The Spirit is already moving. The question is not whether a black pope can lead the church. The question is whether the church is ready to be led back to its fire, back to its courage, back to its universal soul. Because the church's survival isn't guaranteed, but its revival might just be waiting at the gates of Africa. Do you think Rome needs a black pope? But will they let it happen? Let us know in the comment section. Why are they so scared of a black pope? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.